Good morning, everybody. My name is Anatol Poyer-Sleeman. I am that new breed of professional and artificial intelligence lawyer. But today is not about me. I am here to moderate for you our presentation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. So I'd like you to welcome to the stage, with a particular thanks for stepping in at very short notice, Irakli Khodeli, who is the head of the Ethics of AI team at the Social and Human Sciences Unit at UNESCO.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today for this very important event. My name is Irakli Khodeli. As introduced, I'm the head of Ethics of AI team at UNESCO, just across the street from here. And it's a pleasure for me today to be stepping in for the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, Gabriela Ramos, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today because there is an ongoing session of the Executive Board at UNESCO, and she needs to be there. We stand at the forefront of one of the most dynamic, pervasive, rapid technological transformations in history. Artificial intelligence significantly impacts all aspects of our lives, reshaping our work, learning, our societies writ large. However, this transformation brings substantial concerns, and we all know about this. As we marvel at the AI's growing capabilities, especially with generative AI, we must also scale our governance and societal understanding to match this exponential growth. These technologies, increasingly deployed in decision-making processes, risk perpetuating global inequalities if they're not representative, quality-based, and unbiased. We know of the issues, right? For instance, that gender biases in historic data sets exacerbate existing gender gaps and stereotypes. This is a really serious issue. We also know that AI companies often rely on poorly paid ghost workers in the global south to train the AI models, reinforcing the imbalanced global landscape of the AI industry. Today, because of the theme of ChangeNOW, I think it's really important to also focus on the dimension that is often overlooked, and that's the environmental dimension of artificial intelligence. The use of ChatGPT and similar tools have environmental costs. The speed at which the new data centers that these new AI models depend on are built around the world at an exponential speed, and it has been called the largest infrastructure build-out that humanity has ever seen. A recent study estimated that the carbon footprint of training a large language model is equivalent to 125 round-trip flights between New York and Beijing. Researchers also estimated last year, for example, that the global AI demand could cause data centers to suck up 1.1 trillion to 1.7 trillion gallons of fresh water by 2027. Under any circumstances, these numbers would be, of course, worrying, but considering the pervasive water shortage around the world, I think that we understand what that really means. A separate study from the university in Netherlands, this one was peer-reviewed, found that AI servers' electricity demand could grow over the same period to be on the order of 100 terawatt-hours per year, about as much as the entire annual consumption of electricity in countries like Argentina or Sweden. So what should our response be to these challenges? It should not be about controlling the technology, but rather steering its development in a way that outcomes they produce are in line with the goals that we as a humankind have. This is precisely UNESCO's approach to AI governance, focusing on the societal dialogue rather than the technological dominance. That also explains why UNESCO is here on the stage with you today, and I'm very grateful for the organizers for inviting us. People automatically think of the conversation about AI as a technological conversation, and we're here to say that this is really a societal conversation that we need to have about AI. We must ensure that rule of law and creating policy frameworks that mitigate negative impacts while fostering ecosystem with incentives that leverages technology to address our global challenges. Because let's not forget about the tremendous positive potential of AI. It can help accelerate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals if the right applications and investments are made. And the UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence works directly towards these goals. The recommendation that I just mentioned, UNESCO's recommendation on ethics of AI, was adopted about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, by 193 member states of UNESCO. Again, just right across the street at the headquarters of UNESCO. I cannot overstate the importance of having all the member states, countries around the world coming together and agreeing that this will be the set of principles and values and policy applications that should govern artificial intelligence. And since those 2 years ago, we have been very active in working directly with the governments around the world to make this recommendation a reality on the ground. Recommendation also talks about the sustainability and the environmental impact. On sustainability, it requires that environmental impact assessment should be carried out for all uses of AI systems, which includes a measurement of the AI system's carbon footprint, energy consumption, and the environmental impact of the raw material extraction required to support the manufacturing of the technology. In instances where there is disproportionate negative impact on the environment, the recommendation says AI should not be used. In line with the principles of proportionality, entities training and developing AI systems should be incentivized to favor data, energy, and resource-efficient AI methods. Further, we need more incentives from governments to ensure that development and adoption of rights-based and ethical AI-enabled solutions to monitor, protect, and regenerate the environment and ecosystems, as well as for the preservation of the planet. It is worth noting that the recommendation is the only international normative instrument with such a strong emphasis on the environmental consequences of AI. You might have noticed that I have been emphasizing on incentives here and not just a regulation, because that's what we need to do to find the right balance between promoting these technologies and also preventing the harms. So instead of curbing technological progress, we have to guide AI developers towards an ethical approach. For instance, if an AI system is energy intensive, we must incentivize renewable energy solutions because we believe that the conversation needs to be a societal one, not a technological one. This shift in the discussion of AI is what we are striving for at UNESCO. In the beginning, we felt a bit lonely there talking about ethics of AI because the prevailing thought globally was that the genie was already out of the bottle and there was no possibility to control it anymore. Things have changed recently, perhaps because of the release of generative AI. Leaders around the world understood the importance and started to worry, and they became active. We saw a flurry of regulatory initiatives around the world. Perhaps the most prominent and well-known one is the EU's initiative on AI regulation, the AI Act that was recently adopted. But there are also many others, of course, at the national level. We have the executive order by the Biden administration in the US. We have a bill in Brazil. There are many around the world. Also, multilateral platforms are very active in that. G7, G20. You might have heard of the Hiroshima process that was launched last year by the Japanese presidency of the G7. These are all very important initiatives. They all show that we are now converging not on how to control these technologies, but how to create the right conditions and incentives that ensure that outcomes for people are fair and sustainable. While the recommendation on ethics of AI helps to identify and address the risks of AI, it is also about identifying opportunities and promoting ethical development of this technology so that we can harness its tremendous potential to address complex challenges. We need to remember that we're dealing with a truly global technology, and some creators have wittingly exploited loopholes in the regulatory ecosystems and gravitated towards geographical areas where less stringent regulation exists. We must therefore ensure that regulation doesn't serve as a tool for powerful companies to pull up the drawbridge behind them and shut out the competition. As we transition into this new era of AI, the benefits must be shared equitably, not concentrated only in a handful of companies in the global north. To succeed in effective governance of artificial intelligence, and this is our ultimate goal, governments need to act together. That's the aim that UNESCO is working towards with our global membership. Effective governance includes more than just making policies. We must include big tech, the entire business sector, academia, and civil society in this debate. And I'm really glad to know that that's a microcosm. Our panel today is the microcosm of precisely that approach of having the private sector, academia, civil society engaged in the conversation. Some companies driving AI innovation are pushing for smart regulation, and that is true. They understand that good AI, meaning AI aligned with ethical, responsible, and sustainable principles, is also good business. It attracts and retains talent, fosters investment, and builds customer loyalty. This is why big companies like Microsoft, Telefonica, LG AI Research, Salesforce, MasterCard, Lenovo Group, GSMA, to name just a few, are endorsing the recommendation on ethics of AI, and many are also members of UNESCO's Business Council on ethics of AI. We're sustaining open conversation with the private sector. And we're also actively bringing them into the conversation. We have platforms such as the Global Forum on Ethics of AI. The last one was held about a month ago in Slovenia, where you had precisely that type of conversation involving all stakeholders, ministers, governments, but also the private sector and academia coming together to discuss what works when it comes to AI governance at the national level, regional level, and of course, the big question, global level. How do we regulate AI? How do we govern AI at the global level? We believe that understanding these technologies is not only for the experts. It's critically important that government officials, for instance, people that are involved in procuring AI-driven systems in the public administration in the countries around the world, understand what is AI and what the wider implications could be. Because of all the headlines today, scandals, unfortunate outcomes, unfortunately, that are abound from AI usage, people might start to lose trust in these technologies and turn their backs on it. To prevent this, we need to create a positive environment where there are more investments in systems that focus on solving problems. And this is a very pertinent statement to make in the context of ChangeNOW. So that's why we welcome the current trend of establishing AI safety institutes, for example, by, amongst others, Japan, UK, US. These institutes serve not only to better understand the technologies themselves, but also to test the policy solutions and develop further incentives and infrastructures for AI to develop in a safe and ethical manner. Ultimately, our mission transcends regulating AI creation and application. It's about fostering economic system where technologies serve humanity positively, encouraging trust and broader adoption. This is the narrative we must continue to shape, supported by policy incentives and comprehensive strategies. We have examples from other areas, other domains. An example could be Biden Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, which uses policy tools including tax breaks, economic incentives, research and development subsidies to align economic growth with climate objectives. So that's a great example for smart regulation. We need to be able to do the same for artificial intelligence. Another important thing to consider is the question of liability regimes. We need to ensure that whenever something unacceptable happens with AI, responsibility and accountability are clearly allocated. This needs to be a simple way, there needs to be a simple way for individuals or groups to request a redress procedure if an AI system harms a person's freedoms or interests or violates their human rights. The rule of law must be upheld, especially in the digital space. Of course, the best way to ensure fair and ethical use of AI is to vet AI systems before they are ever released publicly. Here, I would like to highlight UNESCO's ethical impact assessment. It's a tool which further complements other tools like a readiness assessment methodology that we are deploying in countries around the world. The ethical impact assessment provides an action-oriented, step-by-step process to help governments, officials, and organizations make sure that their AI systems are aligned with fundamental principles such as human rights, labor rights, and environmental considerations. We need to avoid rushing to implement untested systems with unknown risks, where ethical concerns are only considered after the system has already caused harm. In conclusion, our task is to ensure that AI technologies can flourish while remaining aligned with humanity's best interests, safeguarded by ethical regulation, robust liability regimes, and democratic principles. Let us commit to a future where technology amplifies our human potential without compromising our values and freedoms. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks. How do I go down? This way.
Thank you, Irakli. For our second keynote, I'd like you to welcome to the stage Leonardo Nicoletti, who is a journalist at Bloomberg, who specializes in data and visual storytelling, who's going to give us some insight into some investigations he has done around the generative AI space. Leonardo.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today to discuss such an important topic, together with people that have the power and the resources to improve and regulate artificial intelligence so that it benefits everyone. My name is Leonardo Nicoletti. I'm a data journalist at Bloomberg News. I work with data and visual storytelling to report on issues at the intersection of technology and society. Today, I'm here to talk to you about generative artificial intelligence and the work that data journalists like myself are doing to investigate the potential harms of this technology. First, what is generative AI? Generative artificial intelligence is a new type of AI that has experienced widespread adoption across a number of industries because it makes it very easy to create new content like images or text or videos for things like marketing. Generative AI can also help automate tedious tasks like resume screening and other hiring processes. But as soon as this technology became mainstream, journalists, academics, and everyday people started to notice that generative AI can sometimes lead to undesired outcomes, like when image generators created overly sexualized content for depictions of women, or when a conversation with a chatbot led one user to take their own life. As a result, generative AI became a major area of focus for our data journalism team at Bloomberg News. And so as a leading news organization rooted in data-driven reporting, we wanted to understand how do we evaluate this technology for potential risks or harms? How do we communicate these risks to a global audience? And how do we keep AI developers and AI leaders accountable for these risks? At Bloomberg, our approach is similar to that of academic experts in the field. We design experiments to test and systematically audit AI systems for risks, biases, or harms. Today, I want to share two of Bloomberg's such auditing examples, one related to image generators and the other related to chatbots, and why these audits are an important solution for ethical and responsible artificial intelligence. At the beginning of last year, reporter Dina Bass from Bloomberg Technology and myself, we found that more and more institutions were using generative AI to create images for things like advertising or entertainment, even though there had been minimal external testing into how safe these systems were for the general public. This led us to conduct a data investigation into image generators and the magnitude of gender and racial biases in this emerging technology. We carried out an experiment using one of the most widely used open source models for AI-generated images. It's called Stable Diffusion. Our reporting team used Stable Diffusion to create thousands of images of workers in different professions. We used simple keywords like doctor or teacher to see if they alone would be enough to trigger the AI model towards a particular representation of a specific group or demographic in society. We then analyzed bias in the images created, borrowing methods developed by Dr. Timnit Gebru and Dr. Joy Bulamwini, two leading experts in the field of AI bias. And the results of this in-house experiment corroborated those of the scientific community and has allowed us to highlight a systemic pattern of racial and gender bias where women and people with dark skin are underrepresented across images of high-paying jobs and overrepresented in low-paying jobs. For example, take a look at this sample of images created by Stable Diffusion when it was prompted to create an image of a CEO, a housekeeper, and a judge. You may be wondering if these image sets could just be a representation of the disparities that exist in our society. What we found is this is not the case. By looking at real demographic data and thousands of these images, we found that generative AI like Stable Diffusion doesn't just replicate disparities or stereotypes that exist in our society. It actually exacerbates them and makes them appear much worse than those found in the real world. Let's consider the example of judges that I just showed on the screen. Women made up only 3% of the images generated for this profession. But the reality is, across OECD countries, women make up 54% of judges. There are more women judges than male judges on average. Things got worse when we looked at the intersection of gender and racial biases in generative artificial intelligence. Because stereotypes about gender and race are both amplified at the same time, generative AI tends to produce its most skewed representations of reality when it comes to women with darker skin tones. Let me show you an example of what I mean. While there were almost no women with dark skin tones within images generated for high-paying jobs, when we prompted the generative AI model for keywords like fast food worker or social worker, Stable Diffusion generated women with dark skin tones almost half of the time. We also found that generative AI amplifies stereotypes about what types of people engage in criminal activity. Another example on the screen here. When prompted with the keyword inmate, Stable Diffusion generated 5 images of dark-skinned people for every 1 image of a lighter-skinned person, even though less than half of incarcerated people in each of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada are people of color. And these biases really become more apparent if you do something called face averaging, which is essentially taking all of the AI-generated images for one keyword and you combine them into a typical or average face for that keyword, which is what is shown in this slide. These typical faces make it clear that the AI model paints a picture of the world in which certain jobs belong to some groups of people and not others. A world in which criminal activities are caused by some groups of people and not others. Now, many experts in the field of AI ethics who have been studying AI bias for years now, and whose research has greatly inspired this investigation, have warned that the persistent gender and racial bias in artificial intelligence can cause serious societal harm. Our reporting and interviews with dozens of researchers, activists, and industry leaders has emphasized how biased generative AI systems could exacerbate gender and racial inequality. For example, by creating significant educational and professional barriers for people with marginalized identities, such as women, girls, and people of color. That negative stereotypes can lead to issues of low self-worth, lack of confidence, and other mental health issues for younger generations. In the criminal legal system, AI systems like facial recognition tools are already being used by thousands of police departments. And in the past, bias within facial recognition and other AI tools has led to wrongful arrests. Experts that we have interviewed have warned that the use of generative AI in a policing context used for tasks such as the creation of photorealistic suspect sketches could exacerbate the issue of biased policing. And so bias in generative AI is especially relevant in high-stakes settings. That is, settings like policing or hiring, where AI systems risk to negatively impact the safety or fundamental rights of people involved, as defined by the AI Act, the world's first comprehensive AI law recently adopted by the European Commission. In these high-stakes settings, bias in generative AI poses a serious risk for the automated discrimination of large groups of people. And so in my second example, I would like to talk more about generative AI in hiring, one such high-stakes setting. Recently, our reporting found that employers and human resource vendors are using generative AI like chatbots, think ChatGPT, to screen and rank job applicants. And this has motivated another more recent data investigation led by my incredible colleagues, Leon Yin and Davy Alba from Bloomberg Technology. And this investigation looked at the use of OpenAI's GPT for resume screening. What we found is that GPT will racially discriminate applicants based only on their name. For each of 4 real job postings, we used 8 resumes with equal qualifications and experience. And one key difference, the name on top of the resume. And whether this name is statistically associated with men or women who are Americans that are Black, white, Hispanic, or Asian. We then asked GPT to rank the resumes to identify the most qualified candidate for a real job opening at a Fortune 500 company. We repeated this experiment thousands of times. Even though the resumes were equally qualified, GPT's answers showed stark disparities. For example, for a financial analyst role, resumes with names distinct to Asian Americans were ranked as the top candidate nearly twice as often as resumes with names distinct to Black Americans. We also found that GPT's preferences changed depending on the job posting. For example, GPT was more likely to rank resumes with names distinct to women as the top candidate for a human resources role compared to resumes with names distinct to men. These disparities were so significant that GPT would actually fail adverse impact benchmarks in a hiring setting. For those who are not familiar, adverse impact is a government standard used to test for discriminatory hiring practices in the United States. In this example, GPT has learned that names encode societal stereotypes, and as a result, displays inherent bias when presented with a given name. And the bias here is almost hidden, which makes it very difficult for developers to identify and correct for. So I'd now like to conclude my speech by highlighting why it's important for journalists to do this kind of work, to conduct AI algorithmic audits. On top of demystifying artificial intelligence for everyday people, this work can actually lead to real societal change. For example, our investigation on bias in image generators has been cited now as a main reference for AI policy recommendations for local governments, as well as in official documents about future AI risks from national governments like the UK Government of Science, documents published by international bodies such as the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund, and NGOs like Amnesty International. This story is used as a main reference for AI best practices at dozens of educational institutions like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and in the private sector, it has motivated the development of an AI model trained specifically to address racial bias. There is no doubt that generative artificial intelligence offers great potential to improve our personal and professional lives. But there are also clear shortcomings with this technology, like the issue of amplified gender and racial biases in AI-generated content. As a result, this technology also has the potential to cause harm for certain groups of people. Mitigating these negative outcomes often starts with gaining transparency into generative AI systems. And that's why external algorithmic audits, such as those that journalists do, are important to demystify how generative AI systems work, to highlight their shortcomings, and to improve public knowledge of this emerging technology. By promoting this transparency, audits like these can also serve to inform technological and regulatory solutions that ensure that generative AI systems are built and used around public interests and public values. Thank you very much.
I'd like to welcome to the stage Audrey Herblin-Stoop and Theodoros Evgeniou. I will just introduce Theodoros while he is being mic'd up. He is an academic. He is a professor of decision sciences and technology manager at INSEAD and has been for several decades. He's written on computational ethics, and he's also a co-founder and executive at ChangeNOW, which is a content moderation platform committed to providing a digital world that is safe for all. And also joining us on stage is Audrey Herblin-Stoop, who is head of global public affairs at Mistral AI. We hope to have with us a member of the European Parliament who was partly responsible for drafting the AI Act we've just heard referenced. Unfortunately, they're not able to be with us today, but we'll make a start as most we can. So we're here to talk about the ethics of the AI. Every technology that has ever been introduced has come with a moral panic. You know, is the sky going to fall? But we're also hearing that AI might be different in that it might be a tool that refuses to do some things in the way that a hammer wouldn't. So ethics may be more integrated to it. And we're also hearing that the level of existential threat is possibly only similar to the discourse we've had around nuclear weapons. So I'd like to ask you both, perhaps Audrey first, do you think this is a different ethical conversation to one we've had over and over again throughout history?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us today. So I represent Mistral AI, which is a European company building AI models. I think the way we do it will answer a lot of your questions. The first thing is that we believe that we should build open source model. And actually, that answers one of your points about how do we put ethics at the center of what we do. As Leo just said, it's very important when we think about AI that we will not build models or use models under closed doors, because indeed it's a revolutionary technology. And none of us knows where it's going. But definitely being able to look at the way it works, to be able to allow researchers to look at the models, be able to allow governments, regulators, journalists to look at how it works is definitely something that is really important for us. And so when you think about ethics of AI, definitely it came really fast compared to other technological revolution, or at least change that we have seen in the past, and it's possibly the reason why it came so fast. It took us a long time to regulate social media, for example. So indeed, it's happening really quickly. But at the same time, indeed, the power of AI, and especially of generative AI, is really big. And we need to think about ethics at the building process, let's say ethics by design, to build models that will definitely be able to address those questions, the question of how do we cope the bias question, how do we think about privacy, how do we think about the impact of what we are doing, but also how we work with the application work and all the ecosystem working with our models.
Theodoros, same conversation again or something slightly different?
A lot of yes and no is the answer, of course. Just a clarification. I love the type of co-founder in INSEAD. I'm not a co-founder of INSEAD. I'm a co-founder of Tremo, but that's a clarification. So I'm here with both hats, INSEAD and Tremo, being the startup I co-founded in the space. So first of all, every technology comes with change. Social change, organizational change, geopolitical change, military change, you name it. And of course, change means there are moral dilemmas. There is potentially redistribution of something. And redistribution has, of course, ethical implications behind it. So in that sense, it's the same as any technology. And of course, the bigger the impact on change the technology has, the more. Second, to your nuclear question, nuclear came with kind of little change in a sense, in some sense, right? Because it was not social change directly. It was social change in the sense of geopolitics and political decisions, and of course how people were moving east and west, and how peace was maintained in a counterintuitive way, also because of nuclear, because otherwise the stakes were high. But at the same time, it's different from AI, and AI is different from everything else in a couple of things. To begin with, from nuclear, it's all about the governance. Well, nuclear is all about pressing a button in a sense. Pressing a button, of course, the whole process of setting a button, there's a whole governance that puts kind of limits on who can press the button when. There's a very strict governance, also at the global level, about nuclear proliferation or not. While in AI, first of all, it's not about pressing a button. It's about many other ways it can impact us, in addition to traditional ways technology changed the world. If there is one fundamental difference between AI and everything else that we developed in history before, is that AI has the ability to take increasingly complex decisions, or at least impact decisions, if not take them automatically. And with decision-making comes dilemmas, come trade-offs, come responsibilities, come accountabilities. That's something we didn't have to worry about with other technologies because they were not taking decisions. Yes, we had autopilots in planes, but let's say AI takes a lot more complex decisions and with a lot more trade-offs. So this is a fundamental difference from anything we developed before, decision-making or impact. but also information impact. It impacts how we understand the world. So it has other effects through how it impacts us, because we converse with AI. Therefore, it has an impact on our mental model of how the world is, which therefore affects our decisions, from voting to buying to healthcare to everything. So in that sense, it's very different. However, just to close, much like for nuclear, to find a similarity at least, if there is any, well, there is one similarity, not in the technology, but in how we govern the technology. It took a long time, and the same with the internet, by the way. The internet, I mean, it's been 20 years that now we are taking into account the kind of damage we made with online trust and safety challenges. So much like the nuclear, much like the internet, much like healthcare, much like drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, there is a whole, the same for AI, there is a whole governance structure you have to put in place at the corporate level, at the project level to begin with, product level, right? The safety by design or ethics by design, at the product development level, the corporate level, at the national level, at the regional level, if you should, Europe, and of course at the international level, which is going to be a big challenge.
If I may, it's a lot of levels for startup to compete in this big world. So there's also a question of how do we simplify the government and the regulation to make sure that any kind of companies can actually compete in this very competitive industry, and having a global governance and trying to find rules that would apply everywhere in the world will allow us to adjust to the entire world and to compete with big tech to be quite straightforward.
Well, let's think about that kind of global aspect there. The marketplace could be summarized as USA and China and Europe as the three big players, and they all have different value systems and different approaches to things like regulation. We've just heard about the risk of kind of forum shopping and setting yourself up where you are least regulated. One could oversimplify and try and claim it's regulation versus innovation, but part of innovation is driven by the ability to commercialize and draw a commercial benefit from, and that can be affected by the deployment of proprietary technologies and open source. So thinking about that ecosystem of what drives innovation and how innovation could be building in governance and who should be making those choices, where do you think that should be driven from? Theodoros.
So first of all, let's be clear. Two things. It's not necessarily regulation versus innovation. It can be regulation for innovation. Classic example and the main simple argument to anybody who is against regulation is the following. Would you be willing to put your money in a bank which is unregulated? Is there a market which is unregulated? There is no such thing. The financial sector has been heavily regulated. The same with healthcare, of course. And in fact, trust. Trust is fundamental for innovation and adoption of new innovations. And trust also is supported by regulation. That's the first point and relates to innovation. Second point is that there is no perfect regulation. There is continuously improving regulation. What I love most about the EU AI Act is something that almost nobody talks about. I pay personally little attention on all these high risk, low risk and requirements. That's okay, good, but basic stuff. To me, the most important part of the EU AI Act is how they thought about the governance and the continuous improvement of the regulation over time. That is the most important part of the EU AI Act. Everything else is details because they will change. So it's about basically continuous improvement and continuous improvement. Now, a little bit on, you mentioned about China, Europe, US. I must say we should also pay a very close attention not to leave, in quotes, the rest of the world behind, and the rest of the world, of course, is not behind. For example, the UAE is probably ahead of Europe, and so is Israel, and so are potentially other areas, Canada included, of course. So there are areas which are actually potentially a lot more innovative. UAE has Falcon with an open source kind of ecosystem they built there. They put a lot of money on the open source ecosystem. We are working on a project on that. Let's see how that works out. Open source is a different discussion. I mean, Mistral is playing that quite strong. It's not black and white. It's not very easy. There is lots of issues here around accountability, et cetera, et cetera. But all to say, just to go back to your questions, we have to regulate in order to innovate and adopt.
Audrey.
Yeah, I quite agree. I'm sorry about that. No, definitely regulation, it depends on where you put the regulation. We believe that definitely if you regulate the technology, then you can harm a bit the innovation, because definitely it's moving fast and we don't know what will be the next models. But it's important indeed to build trust, to regulate properly and to regulate the application and how you use the model. And to that extent, the AI Act that the European Union has voted is interesting in terms of regulating by the risk and looking at what kind of risk in which circumstances you will use an AI model, what is the risk coming from that? Is it a high risk? Is it an existential risk, etc.? And coming from that, you will put a different kind of regulation with different thresholds. That's very interesting in terms of the approach, and it will allow companies to innovate as well.
So if we think a little bit about where the ethics are most being questioned, I think very high up on a lot of legislators' lists is misinformation, particularly around radicalization, around deepfake technology, and about interference with democratic discourse and democratic processes. I have an interesting take on this, being both British and European. The Brexit Leave campaign made quite a lot of use of data science and nudge technologies to serve adverts to prompt a particular behavior, and that may well have been, it was a very, very narrow win, that might have been critical. So when you're thinking about these technologies, and these, prohibition doesn't necessarily prevent technology that already exists being deployed, what other than prohibition can be done to protect our key democratic processes, and these are the high point topics? Theodoros, you're smiling at me.
Wow, that's a very difficult question, because as we know very well, it's a very political question. First of all, let's make a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. I'll leave it there for now, but the one is different from the other. It's intention versus not intention. Second of all, managing disinformation or misinformation, even more so misinformation, actually can hurt democratic processes, because the boundary is always gray, of course, right? So it's not just misinformation is bad for democracy, it's also managing misinformation badly is bad for democracy. There is a US Supreme Court case going on. Last week it was a hearing in the Supreme Court. It was a case called Missouri versus Biden. Now it's called Murphy versus Missouri. It's about potential intervention of the government of Biden to online platforms, you were there at the time, regarding removal of content. And the question, what's the process? And that's why it's in the Supreme Court of the US last weekend. It's under hearing. So it's not this or the other. What I will emphasize on, and by the way, this is a topic that it's exactly the number one thing we focus on. We focus on two things in Tremo. One is the topic of online trust and safety, which includes this, and the other is AI safety and responsibility. And on the online trust and safety and misinformation point, the main idea, in my opinion, here is not what to remove, but how to remove it. It's about fair process. It's not about the outcome. It's a little bit like back to philosophy, procedural justice versus distributive justice. We care a lot more about procedural justice. And what I personally love a lot is another regulation in Europe, the Digital Services Act. Of course, we can criticize it about whether it's implementable, lots of question marks. But at least it's built on a fundamental principle, which is fair process, meaning transparency, what is removed, why is it removed, did people complain, involvement, and right to appeal. Those three things are fundamental for fair process, and we should make sure that there is fair process in everything we do, because there is no other way to make, let's say, long-term sustainable decisions in these very gray zones.
Yeah, I think there's several points to get in mind when we talk about disinformation. The first one is definitely we need to separate AI that produce text from AI that produce video and photos. The impact of the disinformation is definitely not the same when you are looking at images that looks real and that you have no way to distinguish whether it's real or not. When you are working with text, and we are a text-to-text company, the question is slightly different, because I think there's enough creativity within the world to have produced misinformation before the rise of Gen AI. And so when we talk about text-to-text disinformation, the issue for us is more on the bottleneck of social media and how it will be distributed. So there's definitely a need to create cooperation and work between a social media company and AI models company to make sure that we have a strong cooperation, and we are helping them to identify a text-to-text generation of disinformation, to flag it and be able to put the correct remediation. And I agree with you that censorship is not always the right remediation when we talk about disinformation. When we talk about image and deepfake, again, we're not producing that, so I only have a view that is not related to what we do. But indeed, there's lots of discussion around should we watermark, should we put label on those type of content. We could. Definitely we could, and it's not that difficult to put watermarking on image. But again, think about who are the bad actors, who are the people we are trying to share this kind of content and produce this kind of content. Will they comply with watermarking? I'm not sure they will. So there's a question of how it will impact population and citizens if at some point you say every content that has been created by an AI will be watermarked, and at some point you see something that has not this watermarked, and then it has been produced by bad actors. So there's a real discussion to have of where do you put, what is the right solution to inform citizens? And I think a huge part of this debate, and it was exactly the same debate 5 years ago with social media, is how do we work on AI literacy? How do we engage in pedagogy about how the AI work? How do we teach people to use our tools properly and to look at them and their output properly? And this is a collective work from obviously the industry, but also we at UNESCO, and they are really engaged in this type of literacy process, but governments and any kind of NGOs, obviously.
Yes, I have a little boy in school, and I was delighted to hear that he is being taught kind of to deploy critical thinking skills to things he sees on the internet. I think it's part of education at every level now. Obviously, I'm a lawyer. You mentioned some legislation, so that got me excited. The Digital Services Act in the EU takes, as you say, a procedural approach that challenges need to be dealt with promptly and effectively. The UK's approach with its Online Safety Act is slightly different, and it's giving positive duties to moderate content onto providers. Which of those do you think is better, having an agile response or a responsibility on deployers of AI to monitor them internally? Theo first.
Good question, and I don't know the details of the OSA, I must say. I mean, I followed it quite a bit, but I don't know the details a bit, so I cannot say much about this. Again, I mean, if there is one sentence to say which covers, it's a blanket sentence, I'm sorry I'm going to say blanket sentence, is that ethics is about trade-offs, and that's a challenge. So any dilemma you put, innovation, regulation, agility, strong hand, it should not be like this or that. It should be about this and that with a needle being left and right. And by the way, the needle will be moving, much like it has been moving for regulations in other sectors. Look at the financial sector. The regulations there have been strict, not strict, then financial crisis, strict again, and then maybe less strict now. So it's all about the process of how to find the balance in a continuous way, back to what I mentioned in the first question. So yeah, I'm sorry, probably I'm not answering your question other than just giving you a blanket answer that it's about the trade-off. You have to manage the process.
Audrey.
I think as well that when we talk about this regulation and content moderation, that's what the DSA is planning, that's a very key point also about AI. We should not reinvent the wheel for any type of regulation. I mean, we do have in Europe GDPR that applies to what we do. We do have DSA that will have an impact on content that has been produced by AI. About the question of who is liable for the content prediction, I think it's a huge question, and it's not really clear so far. But think about the AI model as the engine of your car. So if you have a car, you put the engine into it, and you are driving too fast, who is responsible? The engine producer or the driver of the car? probably there's something in the middle when you talk about AI, because if there's bias in the model, it will impact the results. But again, when you are asking the models to produce a task, you also have a responsibility into your request. And that's also really important when you talk about ethic. There's ethic at the model level, but there's also ethic at the prompt level. The prompt being when someone is requesting the model to perform something. And that's also important for us as model producer, to look at what people can have the model to perform or not, and to think with governments and regulators and NGOs and the civil society about what we can allow people to request the model to be performed or not. That being said, there's many potential for people who are trying hard to push that beyond our guardrails, but at least we can, then it will mean that there's a true intent first, and then at least we have tried to prevent these bad behaviors.
Yes, in the US, we would hear guns don't kill people, people kill people, wouldn't we? So we talked a little bit about the internet. It was originally a military technology. It was about distributed communications to make it harder to take out a communications chain. So the concept of AI-engineered cyber warfare, when critical infrastructure is online, power stations and so on, is the only line of defense going to be AI cybersecurity? And are we going to end up with some sort of cyber evolutionary arms race? Theo.
First of all, I love you put your finger on the critical infrastructure and cyber security. There is a whole term coming up sometimes called safety tech, which includes cyber security, but also AI security and a bunch of others. Content moderation is part of that, because about security in the democratic or whatever political system. In the West is democracy, in China is a different political system, which is at stake, potentially. We cannot just say democracy, because that excludes some people, right, of course. So to pay attention to all those things, even though that's our values, of course, here. So back to your question, there is a term that comes out again and again, and increasingly more so in discussions around AI, national security. It's almost impossible nowadays to be in a conversation around AI regulations, AI competition, AI laws, AI innovations, without discussing about national security. It's almost in every single discussion, at least in some discussions. This, of course, national security has multiple aspects. You mentioned military. AI has, by nature, the dual-use characteristic, civilian and military uses for almost every single application you can think of. What we do at Remo can have a military implication about information gathering or control, potentially, the same what you do over there at Mistral. Almost everything. It's almost impossible to avoid this dual-use nature of AI, which makes it challenging. Right? So in that sense, we have to pay attention to this. But at the same time, there is national security implications around critical infrastructure from the hardware, I mean, cables in the Red Sea or whatever being cut, right, potentially, or whatever else, which is internet cables, to data poisoning, model poisoning. These are terms that, for example, the US National Security, how it was called, National Security Commission on AI. The US National Security Commission on AI, which came up with a report about 2 years ago, identified this, plus data poisoning, plus model poisoning, plus bioviruses innovation, plus disinformation as some of the core national security challenges of AI for the US, and of course that's for everything. So it's important to talk about this.
We're short on time. Audrey, do you want to give any comment to that? No. Okay, well, just before we run out of time then, where do you think the next surprise is coming from? It's coming really fast. We're at a sustainability conference. Is there any emerging use case where you see AI impacting on sustainability and welfare of the planet?
I think there's many use cases, and I think the first challenge that we definitely should address is how do we make sure that this technology is available everywhere for everybody, and I'm thinking about not Occidental world, and that's definitely going with how we train on different languages than English, and how do we make sure that the entire world can benefit from this revolution. But also, I mean, we've talked about what was not going well with AI, but there's also many potential with AI to increase knowledge about everything to everybody, but as well to move faster in the research world. For example, I don't know if you saw this news, but an AI has found a new material to create battery that is not lithium, and this is a research that would have taken 10 or 15 years, and thanks to AI, it was able to push new boundaries of how do we produce more sustainable solutions. And it's the same with bias. I heard Leo's presentation, and obviously the AI will reproduce the bias that it has seen in the data set and in all the content we have all produced during the last millenniums. But at the same time, this is a tool that is working on mathematics. If we teach the tool how to be removed from all the bias we have found, and we use a tool to actually help us take decisions without our own human bias, then we can as well solve some problems.
Yeah, I think there's something slightly self-serving about the AI making access to its power source easier. But Theodoros, any thoughts on?
Well, I'm hoping and waiting for the AI scientist, which you allude to. I think that's the next big frontier, AI that does science, AI that trains AI and improves continuously, the way AlphaGo 2 did for Go, for the game of Go, and eventually doing science. Because if there is one thing that has been moving the needle of civilization, has always been science and technology. And if there is one thing that keeps civilization on tracks, is governance. So I'll close with a distinction. We wrote a number of articles at INSEAD Knowledge. I encourage you to go take a look at this. INSEAD Knowledge, you can find them under my name also, the articles, where it's a series which we call it Good Tech. Not only tech for good, but also good tech around governance and everything else we discussed. So we have to do both, tech for good and good tech.
If you could put your hands together for all of our speakers, please. Thanks very much.